They also have to go through what's called a statutory declaration, and that's a serious legal process. So that's it's a process that shouldn't and can't be taken lightly. I think it is an outrage. It's a democratic disgrace, actually. The Scottish Parliament, which is elected by the people in Scotland, has passed a bill, and that is their job. That's what they have been elected to do. And the bill that they passed was based upon the manifesto commitments of 4 of the 5 parties that are represented in that parliament. It was passed with a significant number as well. So for the UK government to suggest that they somehow have the right to undermine or to overrule the democratically elected representatives in Scotland's parliament is outrageous. It's unprecedented, as you've already said. And you can expect that this is something that we will defend very vigorously.
The concern is that the bill reflects with GB-wide equality laws. So what consultation was there with Westminster to that point to try and make sure that any reforms you wanted to push through didn't contradict GB-wide equality laws?
Well, they don't. So, that's a straightforward response to that. And, if I can just reflect that this is not something that has just been a whim of the Scottish Government. It's not something that is just a policy of the SNP. Just to reflect back again that 4 out of the 5 parties had this as a manifesto commitment. In fact, there were MSPs from all parties, including the Conservative Party, that ultimately supported this bill. It was the subject of very significant consultation, of expert witnesses coming to committee. This is something which has been long in the making. In fact, the SNP have had this provision in our manifesto in 2016 and again in 2021 in the Holyrood Parliament. So this is progressive legislation. This should be a good and positive thing, making life just a little bit easier for a marginalised group. And I really do despair at some of the rhetoric coming out from the UK government. It is not for them to determine what the Scottish Parliament does. The Scottish Parliament is absolutely right and properly making legislation in this area. And it is not at all appropriate for the UK government to come along and suggest that they somehow can knock that out.
So equality laws at the moment protect women's rights and access to single-sex spaces like refuges and changing rooms.
This doesn't make any difference to the provisions for single-sex spaces.
So clarify that for me.
That's quite important. So the rights that people have to single-sex spaces are just the same as the rights that they will have once this bill goes through. This bill is going to make a difference to people in very particular ways, a very small group of people in very particular ways, but will make no difference to your ability to access spaces.
So a trans woman still won't be able to access single-sex spaces?
That's not what I said at all, so I'm not quite sure where you're getting that from. If you
I'm
think
just
about,
trying to get the detail here. So if someone wants to legally change gender, let's say to be legally recognised as a trans woman, the process of obtaining that certificate is now much easier. That is the point of the new reforms going through the Scottish Parliament.
Something that is currently very administratively burdensome, really disproportionately so. It's something that takes a protracted period of time, that can cost in terms of getting the preparations for the paperwork significantly in terms of time and effort. The point is to make these things less burdensome and more straightforward. And that will mean that people, for their, some of the administrative aspects of their lives, have a less challenging time than they do at the moment. But of course, this is something that only is going to be used by a very small number of people. There's no obligation on anyone to have a gender recognition certificate, of course, and it's not something that most of us will come across in our day-to-day lives. So
but it is
if
about
I was
making sure
accessing
it's
a single-sex space, then nobody is asking me for a gender recognition certificate, and I wouldn't expect that to change in any way.
Let's just help our listeners out here by painting one of the scenarios. So an 18-year-old in Scotland would now, rather than for 2 years, live in their acquired gender. That reduces down to 3 months, and there's now no medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria needed. So that 18-year-old can self-declare in their acquired gender, let's just say as a trans woman after 3 months, they can then legally enter women-only spaces like refuges and like changing rooms. So they can then legally do that. What checks are in place, Kirsten?
Can we go back a little bit,
Go
please?
on, help
Because
me out.
that's not a correct reflection of the situation. So maybe just to be clear that if someone wants to go through this process, then they will have to be living in the gender that they identify with for a period of time, and then
3 months.
and this is
3
important,
months.
that's correct.
Right.
So
okay. That's exactly what I said.
Continue,
3 months. Yeah. Carry on.
Then they also have to go through what's called a statutory declaration, and that's a serious legal process. So that's it's a process that shouldn't and can't be taken lightly. And then
But that
there's
is a self-declaration, isn't it?
Well, if I can continue, then there's a further 3-month period of reflection following that. So that is a statutory declaration. It's a legal process. And if someone was found to be deliberately misusing that process, then that
how would they be found to misleading?
If I can conclude, they could find themselves in jail. But
okay,
in terms of some of the questions
who actually
that
checks
you're
up on
asking,
that? Who actually checks up on that? How do you know who's checking whether someone who's self-identified as a trans woman, who is checking during either of those 3-month periods that person is genuinely living as, for example, a trans woman, having been born a man, is living as a trans woman? Who is checking up? Where are the checks? Who is checking?
What is it that you think that they would be checking for? Someone is making a legally binding declaration,
as you said,
that they have done this and that they will be living that way for the rest of their life. It's a serious legal matter. It's something that will affect a small number of people who at the moment can do this, as you know, as
but how do you know that that's not being
But
abused? How do you know that that's, apart from relying on people reporting other people to the police, for example, how do you know that system is not going to be abused?
Well, this is a system that is in place in a number of countries around the world. If you go and have a look at how things are working there, they're operating in a perfectly reasonable way. The other thing that we need to think about is that this is a group of people who are no more or less liable to have people who want to abuse systems of whatever kind within that group of people than any other group in society. So, the notion that people will be looking to abuse that, I think, is probably something that we need to, think about rather carefully. That there is currently a way of checking, who is using a particular space. I don't know how we would imagine that someone would check who was using a single-sex space at the moment. That situation won't change. What will change is that people who currently have to go through a very burdensome process to allow them to have some of the administrative difficulties that they currently face removed will no longer have quite so many administrative difficulties, but they will have to go through a legally binding process, which, as I say, if there was a problem where somebody was determined to be misusing that deliberately, they could find themselves in very hot water. And I think that that's a pretty serious deterrent to anybody who did want to do that.
All right. Well, listen, thank you for explaining it bit by bit to us. We do appreciate it. Kirsten Oswald is the MP for East Renfrewshire and an SNP spokesperson for Women and Equalities in the House of Commons. That is the story today, that Rishi Sunak's government has blocked Scottish gender recognition reforms.